And we continue with a roundup of the day's top stories. Now, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, has sounded the alarm that more than 42 million people in 6 member states face high levels of acute hunger in 2025. The affected countries include Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, and Uganda. Now, to speak a little bit more about this, we joined on the line by Moctar Aboubacar, World Food Programme's Head of Food Security and Nutrition, to give us analysis on the current situation. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
So just we've been speaking a lot around the situation in the Sudan and South Sudan because of the ongoing conflicts, but I want to focus on East Africa now. I've mentioned the countries that are worst affected. Just how acute is the problem? What are the driving factors there?
Oh, absolutely. So as you say, right now, 42 million people, over 42 million people across the countries, the 6 countries, member nations of IGAD, are facing high levels of acute food insecurity. So to put that number in perspective for a second, 42 million, I mean, that's more than the total population of Angola. It's more than the total population of Canada. These numbers are staggering, and in fact, they represent a tripling of food insecurity over the past 10 years. The trend is bad. So these 42 million people plus are classified through what we call the integrated phase classification analysis. This is a collaboration between governments, civil society, and UN agencies. And this is the method that led us to that 42 million number. It's people who, in the best case scenario, face serious difficulties providing food for their families, and who, in the worst case, are facing actual starvation. Now, you spoke about Sudan. The situation is currently most severe in Sudan, it's true. We have 25 million people affected, and there are famine-like conditions unfolding in multiple areas across the country. So, there we could say that there's a peak in severity in food insecurity in Sudan. But as you say, it's a regional phenomenon that we're dealing with. In South Sudan, we can say that hunger is probably more widespread, right? There are nearly 6 in 10 people in the country who are at these crisis or emergency levels of food insecurity. So as you note, this touches all IGAD countries. The situation is bad. The drivers, of course, are also multiple, and they're acting in concert. That's what's very worrying here.
And I'm just also thinking about even more worrying is that a quarter of those facing hunger and starvation are children. I see the figure stands at 11.4 million of children aged between 6 and 59 months. That is a shocking figure.
Absolutely. The malnutrition aspect of this crisis is very hard to understate. 11 million children, 3 million of whom, by the way, are in such dire state that they require immediate life-saving intervention. And the call of the international community through this latest report that came out through IGAD is really a cry of desperation, because we are in these desperate times where, just as women who are pregnant and breastfeeding are themselves malnourished, unable to provide for themselves, they're also bringing malnourished children to health centers near them or sometimes very far from them, making an arduous trek to try to get life-saving assistance, only to find proverbially and literally that door is closed.
So let's talk about the current state of the humanitarian response teams and the resources available to them. Obviously, the biggest challenge is the funding cuts, but also the economic circumstances that these situations occur in. You mentioned that as a combination of factors, but I want to understand what makes it even more difficult to reach those who don't have access to food, internally displaced people, etc., etc.
Yeah. No, as you say, the drivers of this crisis are really deeply interconnected. We're talking about conflict, but also forced displacement, climate extremes. So there's alternating droughts and floods. These are coming together with economic shocks to all reinforce one another. So, for example, ongoing violence will disrupt local markets, while weather extremes like drought are going to ravage agricultural and livestock production. right? And this is a case, for example, that we see in Somalia today. Some of the most vulnerable communities in South Sudan are those who have seen both an escalation in conflict since, in this case, the start of the year, as well as recent flooding. And this has destroyed crops and cut off vulnerable communities from nearby markets. So there's an undeniable link between all these factors. They act in concert. Weather extremes and conflict also have been proven to be closely interrelated, as, for example, more failed seasons will lead to increased competition for resources. Now, the conflicts will cause displacement, and there are millions of displaced in the region today. Displaced, of course, people who will cross the borders will be called refugees. Those who remain within the borders will be called internally displaced persons. The names are different, the hunger is the same. And when conflict still is active, having these displaced populations really exacerbates the crisis more.
And in between when people who are trying to reach centers in which they can get medical attention or emergency aid, as you say, some of them are pretty much near death. And I see that some people are even resorting to eating roots that they can dig up. Does that pose even greater danger? Because I'm thinking in some cases, out of desperation, people are eating what they can, feeding their children what they can. And in some areas, because of lack of water infrastructure, clean drinking water, how much are you seeing that exacerbate the situation, and what are you able to do in the interim?
Yes, absolutely. Whether it be an IDP camp or whether it be a community that's been ravaged by conflict, or another pastoralist community that has seen their herd die over the years due to the stresses of the weather, these factors are very, very clear for all the populations involved. And they are a failing at the systemic level, as well as the sort of proximate drivers that we might understand in terms of conflict. Right, conflict is a driver. The fact that, as you say, there is a lack of water, health, and sanitation facilities in a location also speaks to a bit of a deeper crisis that many of the countries cited in this report are facing. So the crisis of food security is a crisis as well of malnutrition, especially when we talk about famine and famine-like conditions, where to even declare a famine, you have to have those high levels of malnutrition as well. And this is decided through some very rigorous documentation of the evidence. But also, it's a failure at that systemic level. And it means that it's a call, really, for governance and all partners to come together and reinforce not just the immediate needs that people have, but really the systems. And so if I can take the example you say, we need not only to provide food, but ensure that people are able to have their own kitchens, right? Not only provide water, but ensure that the water piping and infrastructure is there. And then that really becomes that governance part, that longer and more systemic piece that also needs to be addressed throughout this crisis.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Really do appreciate it. Just giving us an update on what is being described as Africa's worst humanitarian crisis ever. But this time we're looking at East Africa and Central Africa, including the Sudan. 42 million people in 6 member states of IGAD facing high levels of acute hunger. Speaking to us there was Moctar Aboubacar from the World Food Programme.